Sorry. Yes, remember to keep yourselves muted so that we don't interrupt the flow of the webinar. Ignore the noises in my background. Sorry, I live on a farm. So, yeah, that's inevitable. But thank you so much for coming. We will use the chat for questions, comments, and interactions. So if you have any comments, feel free to drop that on the chat, and we shall be able to pick it up. Let me just acknowledge the team from Global Nation who shall be helping me on Global Public Investment and Global Fund as well, who shall be helping me with the technical side of things, and that's Alan Diaz. Patty Alemani is here as well, and of course Wendy Richardson. They're here to help us, with the technical side of things as well as interpretation. We have Carlos, who shall be interpreting to Spanish, and Maria, who's also in the call, who shall be interpreting into French. And if you look down at the bottom, there is a button reading interpretation, so you feel free to pick whatever language is suitable to you. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you no matter where you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Warm greetings from the proverbial city in the sun, Nairobi. I am Wanjiru Kanyiha, the Network Coordinator for the Global Public Investment Network. I extend a warm and heartfelt welcome to all of you to today's session, a collaborative effort between the Global Fund for Community Foundations, the Global Public Investment Network, Global Nation, and the Shift the Power movement. Our deepest gratitude goes to our esteemed partners for making this event possible. The tireless efforts behind the scenes have brought us here today, and we are truly honored to have them support us in this putting this webinar together. Before we dive into the heart of our discussion today, I would like to acknowledge that the world stands at a crossroads. Many of our fellow citizens and colleagues, especially those in war-torn regions, face grim realities of genocide and crimes against humanity. I ask that we all take a moment to honor the lives lost in these senseless conflicts and recognize that we are living truly in unprecedented and challenging times. Let us take a moment of silence to honor and stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Palestine, Ukraine, the DRC, Niger, Gabon, and countless other places grappling with existential crisis. The challenges before us underscore the need for global unity more than ever before. Can I request that we take a moment of silence to honor those who have lost their lives in the current months? Thank you for that. And even when we find ourselves overwhelmed and powerless, it is crucial for us to remember that we can rise, lift our voices, and pool our resources to aid those in crisis. And we are reminded constantly that we can no longer stand idly by and watch as events unfold in distant lands, assuming that it has no bearing on our lives. COVID-19, the conflicts in Ukraine and Palestine, and the looming climate crisis are daily reminders that we are in fact very, very interconnected. And as we engage in today's conversations and later return to our daily lives, I want to remind us that each one of us has the power to make a difference, not only in our local communities, but also on the global stage. I also want us to remember that we have a role to play, even as we advocate for an influence for every decision and policy at a global level that has human dignity and compassion at its core. And today's dialogue will revolve around the essential role of communities. We will explore how community voices and agency are pivotal in reshaping global international cooperation and reforming the global financial architecture. Together, we will reimagine a development system that is responsive to the challenges of our time, fostering a fairer and more just way of financing development. Once again, I extend my warmest welcome, and I look forward to an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. Keep in mind that this is just the beginning, and we invite you to continue the dialogue with us beyond this webinar as we collectively work towards the change we aspire to see, and particularly as we head to Bogota in December for the Shift the Power Summit. Without further ado, I want us to take time to, to engage, with this very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. And with that, I want to set us off by introducing Jonathan Glennie, who is a writer, a campaigner, and a consultant on human rights, international cooperation, sustainable development, and poverty. His work looks into particular at the changing nature of international cooperation as dominant paradigms and global economic relationships evolve. His book, The Future of Aid, Global Public Investment, was published by Reuters in November of 2020. He's currently the co-founder of a think tank called Global Nation, along Hassan Damuji, working on a new approach of international cooperation, and currently a member of the steering committee of the Global Public Investment Network. Welcome, Jonathan. But before I hand the mic to you, I have forgotten that we had a small exercise that would help us break the ice. So I want to invite my colleague, Alan Diaz, to project some questions that will guide our conversations this afternoon. We are going to just have a few responses that will set the stage for us and see where people are at, even as we get into this conversation. So Alan, if you could just put in the chat the link to menti.com and the code that will allow people to access this question, and we see what comes back in terms of what's top of mind when people think about the world's financial system, the global financial architecture, and how that really affects their community. So feel free to check on the chat, menti.com. Just type that on your URL, pick that URL and put it on your internet browser, menti.com, and use the code that has been provided in the chat. The code is 49632390 on menti.com. I honestly don't know how many words you'll be able to type. Maybe Alan can guide us, but this is just to get a sense of how connected or disconnected people feel to the world's financial system. Great, we're already getting some responses. Degrowth, that's an interesting one. Relevant. Transform, decolonization. So the question is, what changes do you think are needed in the world's financial system to make it fair and inclusive for everyone? Representation, completely dismantle it. I love the radical folks. Complete overhaul. I agree. Reform, accountability, decolonize it, representation, dignity, rebalance, tax the rich. I like that one as well. Localization, access, transparency, less requirements, equity, trust in local people, humanity. I saw humanity somewhere.
Different names. Decolonization.
Mutuality. Sensibilidad. I guess that's sensibility. I don't know. Maybe the translators can help us with that. Yes, humanity. Oh, sensitivity. Okay. All right. Thank you for that, Carlos. Comprehensibility. Increase corporate tax. Okay. All right, great. These are good responses. Disruption. I like that. Transformation. Thank you so much. I think we can save this screen, Alan, for later as we go through our discussions today. Perhaps we can project the next question, then we can introduce Jonathan to take the floor and talk a bit more about global public investment. So this is the next question. What comes to mind when you think of global public investment? What comes to mind when you think of global public investment? Great. Togetherness, new approach, equality, hope, alternative, all benefit, all contribute. Red tape, that's interesting. Hope, a Western idea. Ideals, change, new paradigm, shared benefits, need to understand more, rebuild governance, transformation, end of the aid narrative, hard to implement, shared benefits, equal distribution, local, which I would imagine means global and local. Right? I would imagine that's what it means. Togetherness, fair tax system, it's unclear, not sure. That's fine, hard to implement, inclusive financing. All right, thank you. This is also very interesting. Thank you so much for this. Right, great. So I think at this point we can take this down as well and invite Jonathan Glennie, whom I had introduced before, to talk to us about global public investment, its history, what it means, break that down a bit, remove the complexity and jargon. No pressure, Jonathan. But over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, great to see everyone. I'm here in Bogota, Colombia, and my organization, Global Nation, along with an organization called Territoria, we are hosting the Shift the Power Summit in December. So really excited to receive, I hope, many of you on this call. In Bogota. It's going to be an amazing summit, and I hope you're going to have an amazing time. My day job is working on a number of ways of increasing mutuality and dignity and respect in international cooperation. And global public investment is one example of that, and it's a growing movement and an increasingly recognized new approach to kind of post-aid approach to financing the things we care about and the things we need to finance in the 21st century. So I'm just going to very, very briefly, I think and I hope that some of you at least will already know something about global investment, global public investment. I haven't been given very much time. Can you just go on to the next slide, please? Because we want to really spend time discussing. So I'm just going to give you the briefest of summaries. And that's done in this infographic. Pretty much everyone agrees that the global finance system is out of date. It emerged after the Second World War, and in a period when Western countries still had many colonies, and it was built by a handful of powerful countries, the Bretton Woods institutions, of course. And it still suffers from the hangovers of colonialism. It's framed as aid. The vast majority of money comes from a handful of countries who decide how that money gets spent, basically in Paris and Washington. Paris is where the OECD sits. And that means that there's not enough money, and it is directed in a way that is not democratic or representative, and that means that it's not going to the priorities where it's needed, and it's less effective, because all the evidence demonstrates that the higher levels of participation and ownership in priority setting, but also in management, leads to more effective spending. I mean, it is hard to spend. It's even hard, public spending at a national level, as we all know, looking at our own countries, is really hard to get right. Public spending at an international level is even harder to get right. We're not simple idealists. We know that these things are really, really hard, but we believe that the current system can be significantly improved. And that is where the global public investment idea comes in. And it's summarized in the middle there: a new system to unlock more and better funding to achieve our common goals based on the principles of all benefit, all contribute, and all decide. So the first realization is that we need tons more public money at the international level. And that may sound obvious to people on this call, but it's not part of the current discourse and hasn't been for many years. In fact, the theory of aid, insofar as there is one, is that aid must gradually diminish over the 21st century as countries, quotes, graduate from poverty, from a poverty status, and then no longer require, according to this theory, aid. I'll stop saying quotes. I'll just use the words. It's just too boring, but you know what I mean. So our argument is no. As priorities change and the complex problems we face in the 21st century become clearer, the most obvious is climate change, but health security, traditional development, i.e. poverty reduction, job creation, conservation of our planet, so many areas where we know we need to have a coordinated approach at a global level, which needs tons more money, and we argue tons more public money. And that again is not a given. There is a strong argument in many countries that this money can mostly come from the private sector, and indeed the private sector will be crucial, but it has to be managed and directed via the public sector, otherwise it won't be fair and effective. So in summary, how would GPI help? GPI would mean all countries committing funds according to a fair contribution formula based on capacity and responsibility. It doesn't mean, of course, that the wealthier countries won't be putting in tons more, but it transforms our way of thinking about international public finance away from a donor-recipient model towards an all-contribute model. And that means that everyone, crucially, and this is the second point here, gets a seat at the table. GPI would involve a more representative decision-making structure, including civil society, which is something we're going to talk about today, enhancing legitimacy and effectiveness. And that's crucial. You move the so-called recipient countries, lower and middle income countries, move from being, quotes, recipients of international public money to being co-contributors, obviously contributing according to their size and historical responsibility, but still contributors, and that transforms the way that we talk about this. And finally, GPI's inclusive approach will provide the long-term reliable investments we need to meet shared global ambitions without overburdening ODA. The relationship between ODA, aid, and global public investment is something that we're actively working on as a network, and there are different ideas within the network. And then on the right, there's just a few examples of, and there are many more, but a few examples of the leading figures and organizations that are beginning to support the GPI approach. And it's really become a discussion point now in many of the major processes as we transform international public finance. You could think about the G20, you could think about the financing for development process known as ADIS plus 10 at the moment, and the climate process and others. And there's just a few quotes there from Mariana Mazzucato, Winnie Byanyima, Bart Vega, who is the head of NORAD, Degan Ali, who's a great part of the Shift the Power network, and Eleanor Bertancourt from Colombia, who I was with yesterday, and who are very keen on this GPI approach. Maybe they'll come to the Shift the Power summit, not sure. So, and there are many more we could have put there. Next slide, please. I don't know if I'm doing a good job at presenting this. I'm trying to do, 10 years work in kind of 10 minutes. Importantly, so that's the kind of what the approach is. And here's the process we've gone through to build it, which I think is really, really crucial. 6 years on the left there, summarized in, building an increasingly intensive international research and retreats. And then in 2019, we launched this paper called Global Public Investment, 5 Paradigm Shifts for the Future of Aid in UNGA. In 2020, we launched an expert working group. Some of you were on. There's about 20 to 25 people from around the world to build this. And then with encouragement and help from Civicus, and Anna is on the call today, we started a global consultation in 2021. And we talked to many organizations around the world, all with a view to helping build this GPI approach. And the point of consultation always is twofold, isn't it? It's to bring in amazing ideas to improve the concept, but also to legitimize the concept, to bring in more and more people to feel like they own it and are part of building it. And again, that's going to come up as we discuss the role of communities today. 2022, we launched the GPI network. We've been building something, a movement of some kind for some time, and then formally we launched it in 2022, again at UNGA. And it's great that Wanjiru is leading us, come from the Shift the Power movement as well. And Alan has been working also for some time now to support the network. And then in 2023, this year, we've just launched this amazing report, which has got views and perspectives from around the world in different sectors. And I think it demonstrates the growing interest and support for the GPI concept. Yep.
Sorry to interrupt. We've gotten a request to slow down because of the translation, the interpretation. Yeah.
So I'm going to slow down.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And so in 2024, building towards the G20 in Brazil, South Africa, and I mentioned that is +10, and also there's the Summit for the Future. So that's just an expression of how we're planning to do advocacy around this new approach. Okay, next slide, please. What have we got? Oh yeah, and this is just a representation of all the members that are currently part of the GPI network. And on Wanjiru's behalf, I encourage you to join, because what we're trying to do is ensure, like I said, that we get as many different perspectives and political support and legitimacy from around the world to ensure that we get the big calls right. Because in advocacy, it's always a balance between the long-term transformational shift that we all want and the winnable change given political realities. And those kind of discussions happen all the time. And the most important thing is who's in the room in terms of their experience and perspective. So really keen for people to engage with this process. Now, I feel like maybe that wasn't a bad summary given the amount of time I had, but I'm sure there'll be loads of questions. And I don't know how Wanjiru is going to manage it, how much we're going to go into detail on GPI, or how we're going to move on more quickly. And then I think there's another slide where there are some questions setting out this. Yeah. So for me, the two main questions, I mean, I think, and I'm very proud of the way that we've been really, really inclusive. It's never perfect, but I think over the last few years, we've made a huge effort to include voices from around the world, different sectors, different types of organizations, and that's how we've got to where we've got to. But I think there is this issue of community level engagement, which is not my area of speciality. And I think it is really difficult. I mean, there's so many, when you go down to community level, you're talking about literally millions of communities around the world. And then it's not only geographical communities, but rather sectoral communities, in other words, thematic issues where there are global communities. So I think it's a really good question to say, we've done well, but how can we better integrate the voice of communities as we co-create the GPI approach? So that's how do we build this together with communities? And then the second, and that's a process question. And the second question is thinking about thinking about actually what GPI looks like. So it's not just involving communities in building the approach, it's actually ensuring that what GPI looks like also involves communities in the delivery of public money. and the spending and management and governance of public money. Now, again, an incredibly complex area, because on the one hand, you basically have to have some kind of subsidiarity all the way from the UN in New York, through the states, through subnational, including civil society, and all the way down to community level. We know that's necessary. We know it's always going to be miles from perfect, but how do we ensure that this new approach that we're proposing doesn't fall into the same traps as the old approach, and actually really integrates the voice and experience of communities in delivering change?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think you've done a great job of introducing an otherwise complex, idea. I think you've done quite well. Thank you so much for that. For that presentation. I know there are questions in the chat. We can keep engaging on those, but I want to quickly move to introducing our panel. Alan, if you could take down the slides, and of course we'll provide a session for question and answer, but I like, Jonathan talking about the issue of legitimacy, right? Where does this idea draw its legitimacy? Where will the ownership come from? The extent of, the organizations that are helping co-create this idea. We are saying it's not perfect, and there's an opportunity for us to engage at community level in whatever form or shape that will take. We know it can get messy and complicated, but we know humans are messy and complicated, but that's where the growth is, that's where the content is and the substance is. So we are happy to have this conversation, to take questions, to take critiques, on how we can grow this system of financing development. So I want to quickly move on to the next session, where I will introduce our panelists for the main discussions, including Jenny Hodgson, Solange Baptiste, and Anna Ferreira. If we could kindly spotlight them so we figure out where they are. Jenny, of course, who is no stranger to many people on this call, but I shall still introduce her. And she is the executive director of the Johannesburg-based Global Fund for Community Foundations. And it was established, this foundation was established in 2006. She has overseen its emergence as a leading global voice on community philanthropy as a core strategy for people-led development and shifting power closer to the ground. Based variously in Uganda, Kenya, Russia, Singapore, and Thailand, Jenny has been involved in philanthropy development in emerging markets and developing context for the past 2 decades. She has a BA in English from Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's also a board member of the African Philanthropy Network and a trustee of Comic Relief. And again, apologies to the translator. Sorry, please keep reminding us if we are speaking too fast and we need to slow down. Secondly, I want to introduce Ms. Solange Baptiste, who is the executive director of the International Treatment Preparedness Coalition, otherwise known as ITPC. Solange leads community activists and allies from across the globe to deliver ITPC's mission to achieve health and social justice through robust community engagement. Her work revolves around elevating community expertise as a vital contribution to challenges facing us in health, climate, and development. In her dynamic career, Solange has focused on HIV as an entry point to the broader right to health, with her efforts extending to addressing issues facing the most affected populations, including young women and children. In particular, she has worked on ensuring access to quality treatment through health, education, demand creation, community-led monitoring, and strategic interventions to make medicines and diagnostics more affordable. Solange is committed to ensuring that the voice of affected communities influences the decisions and policies that affect their lives. And she's also an active member of the GPI network and a part of the steering committee. Last but not least, we have Anna Ferreira, a dedicated social development activist from Venezuela. with over 6 years experience working on the transformation of realities through meaningful youth civic engagement, education and sustainable development. Her organization, Civicus, is a member of the GPI network and seeks to amplify the voices and opinions of ordinary people. It recognizes that for effective and sustainable civic participation to occur, citizens must enjoy rights of free association and be able to engage all sectors of society. She's part of the Civicus Youth Action Team, which is a group of young voting members of Civicus, led by the youth and acting for the youth to be meaningfully represented and engaged in all of the alliance's structures, governance, strategies, and activities. I love when the youth are involved. We can no longer keep the youth voices out of any of the conversations that we're having. So a warm welcome to our panel, Karibuni Sana. And I will straight away start with Jenny to just explain and give us a brief history of the Shift the Power and why it is important for communities and for a broader spectrum of development stakeholders, and why this conversation are very important at this particular time. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Wanjiru, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the call today. As I think Jonathan experienced, the sort of navigating complexity in a few minutes is the challenge here, but also the sort of sense of the huge opportunity of the moment that we're at. I want to say a little bit about the origins of the Shift the Power movement, because it came really out of a very quiet, boutique, overlooked, neglected part of the philanthropy and development system, if you like. And its origins come from the emergence of community philanthropy as a form of development practice. The Shift the Power Summit, which really kind of start to galvanize a sense of a movement, happened in 2016 in Johannesburg. But it was based on 10 years work before that to build, to support the emergence of community philanthropy as a strategy for building power, resourcing development, and managing complex systems of power in some of the ways that I think Jonathan has described as the sort of what's wrong with the development system. And I just want to say a word about community philanthropy, because actually I think at its heart, it mirrors at a community level what global public investment is trying to do at a global level. So back in 2006, when the Global Fund for Community Foundations was first set up, it was really in response to this notion of emergence, of emergent practices, of emergent institutions, led and shaped by people who had often worked in mainstream development or in international NGOs and had decided to step out and do something else, build from somewhere else, and not try to battle sort of broken systems, but to build their own thing. And really, it was around the idea of what happens when you start to involve people in their own development, to emphasize the fact that they have assets and they have resources, but often that these are overlooked by the dominant system. Communities are led to believe they have nothing, and therefore they have no voice and no stake. So actually, what was this practice looking like from the ground up? When you start a different conversation around building trust, around building collective power, about building collective voice, around harnessing resources that we know have always flowed around the world, that is communities that respond to crises in the first instance. How do we start to insist on making what was previously invisible visible, and a source from which to negotiate new forms of power? So that looked like the Kenya Community Development Foundation, for example, which was set up 25 plus years ago by a group of civil society activists who believed that another way of doing development was possible. That included external resources, but also, and importantly, put a key role on the role of communities, a key emphasis on the role of communities, and emphasizing their resources and what changes when people start to realize that they are not beneficiaries, but actually they have a seat at the table. Now, we know in big development, the table is usually nowhere near communities. So this idea of GPI being a song out to the world and community philanthropy being one of the responses that sings back to say, actually, how do we model and mirror these kinds of collective ways of working together? So in many ways, like the localization agenda, like the commitments of the climate financing community, that everyone has sort of got the memo that you need to get resources to the grassroots. And yet, if you ask people on the ground in many parts of the world what localization is, or whether they are aware of commitments made to fund climate justice, you know, this disconnect between people experiencing the negative impacts of a failed funding system and yet having no way to articulate their frustration, to recognize that it's systemic failures, I think is critically important. So let me say a word now about Shift the Power. In 2016, we realized that there was this sense of emergence of women's funds, of socio-environmental funds, of community foundations, of grassroots grant makers, of institutions that were looking at and thinking about local resources, local voice, local power. But easily these organizations could be misunderstood by the dominant system as intermediaries, as mechanisms or instruments through which funders could deliver aid. And I think that sorry, I've lost my track because something just popped up on my Zoom screen. So this idea, oh no, I've forgotten where I was going. Somebody tell me what I was just talking about. Sorry, it's Zoom, not now.
You were talking of misunderstanding of intermediary.
Oh yes,
roles,
of intermediaries. Thank you so much. Sorry, Zoom's sending me messages and I can't multitask at the same time. Thank you very much for that. So the idea of the summit was really to sort of say this is a proposition about power, about shifting power from the global north to the global south, but also looking at emergent practices coming from civil society and grassroots movements that were deliberately and intentionally thinking about their own power structures and how they were governed, how decisions were made, what resources got counted, and actually starting to blend new types of working that insisted that everyone had a stake at the table. So the summit was held in Johannesburg. We had 400 people from 60 countries, and it was this exciting moment that actually other ways of doing development were possible. And these were the people and organizations that were indeed doing it on the ground. And from then on, really Shift the Power has been a sort of beacon for anyone who believes that different ways of doing things are possible, whether from the bottom up, from the top down, really a way to try and build new alliances of people who accept that the status quo is not okay, not fit for purpose. And not only that, but were we to look carefully, we would see emergent practices and ways of working bubbling up around the ground, from the ground up. What if we were start to take those and embed them at the heart of a development system that was fit for purpose, that centered dignity, that centered equity and centered trust at the heart of it? So Shift the Power now is really, clearly there's not a single silver bullet. Community philanthropy in itself is not sufficient to shift the power. But when you start looking at the different dimensions of building the system that we want, which is one of the things we've tried to sort of embed within the Shift the Power agenda, it is the vision that there's a normative role to development work, and that is around good societies in which people can live in safety and security and be treated with dignity. So the question for us is, then, how do we get to that? What do we need to stop doing and what do we need to start doing? And so these dimensions of work around whose resources get counted, what evidence is collected, who decides what gets measured, how do we start to reimagine the structures which we're in, the institutions we're in, the governance structures that we've inherited, which are often deeply outdated and antiquated and not fit for sharing and shifting power. So for me, Wanjiru, the idea of why this conversation is important to talk about global public investment and the re-envisaging of a new system at a macro level, which centers the key principles which are central to community philanthropy too, which is everybody contributes, everybody decides, and everyone stands to benefit. It creates a circular logic rather than a donor-beneficiary one. It creates a notion that power exists within the relationships rather than it is a finite resource that one has and another doesn't. So Shift the Power is really a field of many campsites, of many tents, of many fires. But the field itself is this idea that new ways of doing things are possible and that they need to be shaped by, at the policy level, in global infrastructure, but they also need to be shaped from the bottom up. If we can mirror the values and the core concepts of what this work is about, then we start to kind of get a system that's truly cooking. I'll stop there, Wanjiru, and apologies for my slight glitch along the way.
Not to worry.
Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. I always love hearing from you. I always glean something new when you talk about the history of the shift the power and, you know, the vision and the drive around communities and community agency. And I know that there can be a disconnect many a time, and you alluded to it, between the macro policy level stuff and the day-to-day community-led engagement. So my next question is for Solange. If you could kindly turn on your camera, and, you know, just give us a bit of context, right? Of context, especially with your vast background in community organizing around health, especially, and your involvement with the GPI movement, and what your thoughts are on how GPI and the GPI principles mirror or, you know, weave into restructuring international cooperation, and how the principles are advocating for community work and building agency for communities. I know that's a long question, but, you know, would love to hear from you, your experience around community mobilizing and how really GPI can play a critical role in community work.
Thanks, Wanjiru. Such a short, simple question. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I mean, I think just following off of Jenny's comments, which I think really overlap with some of how I would want to respond to this. So the concept of GPI, I think, is often sort of seen as an issue for nations and blocks of nations. You know, you think of the G20s and the G7s and the BRICS and et cetera, and you think about how they play well together or not. But I think the core principles are uniquely ancient and indigenous, and, you know, rooted in like traditional community ethos. So the idea of taking care of each other in a global community, between, you know, if you think about in the African context, things like Ubuntu, you know, it's all about interconnectedness and harmonious living and leaving no one in the community or in the village behind, and how can we take care of each other. And I think there are similar concepts across the globe, from Japan, right, to like the Andes, the Andean people across the globe. So I just want to reclaim that as something that is actually from the community, that was given to the global space, as opposed to this sort of top-down way of thinking about it. And I think the question that you asked me is around communities, and I really like that distinction between communities that are impacted or affected, as opposed to the broad civil society, which in many cases we kind of think of non-government. So anybody that's not the government, which is a huge cross-section of organizations and people with varying interests. But I think if we were to zero in on those that are impacted directly by the negative consequences of these policies that we make in the halls of power, we get into a very specific space. I think the way to think about it is that when we have less money on the table, very practically, everybody is very concerned all of a sudden by who is making the decision about what we're going to do and how much money. So those people that are involved get into really sharper focus, and, you know, the ripple effect then moves into sort of a greater need for transparency. All of a sudden, we're concerned about having a voting, well, not all of a sudden, but it comes into sharper focus. You need to have a voting right, not just a seat at the table. We don't want to just be included in consultations when you've already come up with your own thing. So we got us to rubber stamp as communities. So I think that is the way that these things ultimately connect. And so agency for communities, I think, are growing. There's a lot of resistance because ultimately we're talking about power shifts, right? The incentives that are set up in our current world do not make this easy. And so, you know, rich countries can lose power if they follow GPI, right? But they lose control over what they want to fund because they've put in more money. But in a sense now, the pot is bigger because everyone is putting in money. If, as we talk about what Jonathan described, you know, it's no longer the donor recipient divide. Everyone will contribute. And then the poorer countries have to put money in. So they're not just recipients with, this concept of, well, what can you give to me? I'm a poorer country, but they now get a chance to influence decision-making. And I think that is a very interesting thing that happens because, we've had many conversations within the steering committee around, getting the concept socialized on the macro scale. When you have this conversation at a national level, you really see where power problems lie. And that's when governments aren't so happy to have communities now input and contribute and talk about how they should influence what's happening at a national level. And I think it's just, it's a matter of scale, these problems. And I think it's interesting to think about, where do we go from here? It's that question of how does change really happen? Maybe there are like three schools of thought. Those that think it happens in sort of a macro scale, you need governments to kind of make policy and the IMFs and the World Banks, and it trickles down and then we figure things out, sort of that whisper in the ear of the minister kind of concept. Or is it civil society, people power, people putting pressure on the system? Or those that will like to have a nice in between and say, well, you have to do both. But it's interesting because if you don't do one or you do the other, where do we land? And I think it'd be interesting to hear the comments from the people on this call about how that change will really happen and how can GPI really take off. I'm just quickly trying to run through the question and kind of moving to the all benefit, all contribute, and all decide. I think the question is around like, how do they complement each other, and, what does this mean for communities? And I think, this idea that governments always represent what people think, I think that is less and less the state. If we think about Brazil to like France, there's just like polarization within the citizens, the people living in the country. So you might have a leader, but they don't speak for the whole of the nation. So it's the question of like this government, and what does contribution mean from France? What does contribution mean from any other country, right? And is it just money? Are we talking about just contribution in terms of dollars? How do citizens or communities contribute in terms of data, lived experiences, innovation, solutions? We saw a lot of that happening during COVID, where the global scene didn't understand what was happening and was looking for solutions on the ground. And coming from an HIV background, I understood, a lot, because a lot of the public health architecture in low and middle income countries is built on HIV. And so there was an ability for us to say, well, this is what we're seeing, and we're using this thing to get, protective gloves and sanitizer, et cetera, to healthcare workers. I think the question of how can we practically move, I think I have still have some time, right? I'm trying to rush through my thoughts, Wanjiru. You'll stop me when I'm over talking.
1 minute. 1 minute.
What does it mean practically to support communities, to kind of actualize this? I think it's what we're doing now. It's the ability to kind of have that ripple effect among leaders, grass tops, and then it will finally get to grassroots. People who are working with literal people, not just in an academic space, or, you need to do all. So socializing the concept, including GPI in the solutions that we come up with to the challenges, putting it in our talking points, putting advocacy money towards it, and convening and linking to health, good governance, climate, social protection, gender, girls' empowerment, not just the usual suspects, because it's very easy to think of this as a development issue, a tax issue, a financing issue, when in fact it's about social goods, it's about the common good. And we need to see how to link those things in so we can get diverse perspectives. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Solange. And it's unavoidable, the questions of power and power play and where power lies, when you're talking about these things, and how to, to literally and, shift the power from the decision makers and see how that power flows through the ecosystem to the decision makers and so on. So my question to our next panelist, Anna, and because you're representing the youth, how do you see the GPI agenda align with the youth agenda? and why should the youth care about it? Because I was in a session yesterday where we were, talking about the youth question and how, globalization, I saw that word earlier, has really sort of skewed how the youth are growing up, right? They have, local experiences, but global expectations. So how does this agenda align, and how do you see Civicus, helping us, build momentum around the idea of GPI?
Thank you so much. And I subscribe to everything Jenny and Solange were saying regarding the challenges that in general we face when trying to decolonize funding and shape this structure in a more accessible, approachable way. But imagine all of those challenges, how greater they are for young people. And I'm not just saying this from my headspace out. We actually, from Civicus, we conducted a research. We interviewed over 56 movements worldwide. We followed them for 6 months to understand their challenges, their tactics, what motivated them. And what we found out of all of what the youth movements have in common is that actually one of the core elements for youth movements growth is particularly the relationship to financing and the relationship to the power structures surrounding them. So for decolonizing public investment, that's in the top of the youth agenda. But at the same time, it's not on the top of the manageable elements of the youth agenda. It's the element that seems most further away, because we are not at decision-making positions. And most of the time when civil society is asked to be part of a table, usually it's INGOs that are asked to be part of the table. And we have learned with trying to localize things that that's not the real representation of grassroots. So we take it a little bit further, as Civicus did in 2021 with the consultations, trying to put local members together, trying to socialize all of this structural changes with international funding architecture, trying to actually get a cross-check of, is this really necessary? How do we take the conversation less technical and make it more accessible? In that entire conversation, even the youth representation was really low, because the access to international spaces that youth local movements have, it's extremely limited. So in that element on how to move forward, the necessity of youth being part of the agenda needs to be something actively thought about. And one of the barriers for that to be included is that there is this really big importance in the values of how youth movements work in accountability and inclusion. And in this side is understanding the challenges that movements have when they face the power structures. It's not the same to frame funding and public investment strategy in a freedom-restricted country than in a country that has a bit more open civic space. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration for us to really have an ecosystem that feels inclusive and calls people to also join. And that's the way that this can actually work. In the concept, we support this initiative so much, but being youth, the ones more affected, we are always expected to be the ones that deliver the message, but we are almost never in the shaping part of the message. So there's the need for investment of resources in the sectorization of consultations for youth and new methodologies, and the allocation for local youth champions to harvest inputs, opinions, and turn into an actual movement of socialization of this necessity. I take the conversation of public funding down to the grassroots and inside the scope of possibilities that youth movements have for their action. Imagine that one of the things that we realized in the research when talking to all of these amazing activists was that most of them are actually going further away from the public space into more private spaces and finding their resources on their own ways. So it's actually antagonizing, it's actually bubbling itself to go away from the system. And initiatives like this are a great opportunity to push that closer and to not segregate what youth movements and local movements are doing into one bubble of the conversation, when they're actually most of the youth movements and working grassroots are complementing or even doing initiatives that should be in the public agenda, that should be public policy, but because of many reasons of the context, that they need to be done by groups that organize themselves to do so. So in that element of discussing public investment, all of those initiatives shouldn't be in the private element, shouldn't be a separate conversation, and shouldn't be orphaned in whatever we discuss in the higher level panels and discussions. So for this co-creation and allocation to particularly have youth voices actively included in the entire process is extremely important. And as a representation of Civicus, I have witnessed the openness of the network to the consultations, and I know that this is further in the plans that all of this can become and can help the ecosystem grow.
Thank you so much for that passionate response, Anna. And I feel your pain, being, you know, the not on the decision-making table, but having to face the consequences of decisions that are made for you. So I really like your passion in engaging in these conversations and bringing the youth along with us, you know, even as we continue to, you know, to have these discussions, to frame these questions and figure out the answers. Because it's, you know, it's true. We don't have, as adults, if someone can put it that way, we don't have the answers, and we tend to, you know, put the youth on the back burner, thinking that their time is yet to come, but their time is here already. I want to open up the floor for questions, but before I do that, I know, Wendy, if you could help me go through the chat. Sorry, I'm not able to sieve through the chat and multitask very effectively. But if you could help me just go through the questions and see what we can read out loud to our particular panelists. But I want to give this opportunity to anybody with direct questions to the panelists. If you have a burning question, we can take this intermission to, you know, to have that session of Q&A, and then we can go to the last round of presentation by the panelists. If you could raise your hand if you have a burning question, then I can allow you to unmute your mic before we go to the questions in the chat. And thank you. I can see Jacob has, you know, listed a few questions there, as well as Morag. But anyone from the floor who has any particular questions before we go into the chat? Please. All right, Wendy, maybe you can help me go through the chat for particular questions.
Well, could I invite those people that put questions in the chat to perhaps pose them rather than me picking out what might be most important or relevant? There, we have a hand raised, Wanjiru. First volunteer. Wanjiru, you were on mute.
Go ahead, Godly. Sorry if I...
Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon to you.
Fantastic panel so far, so thanks to everybody. I had two questions in the chat, actually listening to excellent interventions. I'm an old mama in this field, and so I have several questions that stem from my own struggles. One was to Jenny, but actually also maybe to the others. There are many ways of shifting power, I put in the chat, and one way is to shift power from A to B, but not changing the practices. So basically, bully number one is replaced by bully number two, doing the same thing, but now it's somebody else in the chair. So how do you get away from that? Because those games we see a lot. And then a second question was more to do with who is involved as we speak in setting this agenda, because I saw in the list of logos I used to be director of Coordate in the Netherlands, so I have a little bit of sense of old style development agencies. And not to say anything negative about Coordate, because it tried its best, but I remember even from my time there were a lot of internal discussions about how to shift this agenda and how indeed to help shift powers. But of course, there was always the element of how to stay in business. And so I think, a level of honesty about pitching versus sharing or preaching this agenda because you want to stay in the game, rather than say, well, how fundamental and how radically are we ourselves willing to shift? So those are my two questions, and I don't have answers. I'm just, this is my struggle, and I would like to hear your views on that. Also, maybe people in the room. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Very relevant questions. Maybe Jonathan, you want to take one of them? The last question. You're muted.
I'm happy to, but I'm just going to answer really, really briefly because I'd love to hear more. But I mean, I think the issues you raised, I wish I had an answer to them. I think, the hard but relatively easier bit is analyzing the problem. And I think we've done that well, and setting out where we need to get to. And I think we've done that well. The difficult bit is a strategy to get there, balancing, as I said in my remarks, the kind of visionary change that we need to see with the urgent winnables that we also need that have to take into account political context and reality. So just a great example is we need tons more money on climate really, really soon. The World Bank exists. Do we funnel money towards the World? I mean, I'm simplifying massively here. Do we funnel money towards the World Bank, or do we try and set up new systems that we know are going to be better? It's a difficult one, and we don't have, and the network is full of, and the good thing about the network is that it's got people who work on those kind of short-term winnable wins, and people who are working on building the context for a more radical change, which will take years, which won't happen in 2024, but might be beginning to happen in 2026, 27, 28. And we're trying to balance both of those. That's the best I can say. I mean, if we had more time, we could go into detail on all the various processes that we're trying to work on. The final thing I will say is that we have worked, we've really listened to people who've said, look, don't just set out a visionary change. We need to see change soon as well. So on the one hand, we're saying global public investment needs to be this kind of new global system for financing for sustainable development. But also in the shorter term, we can work with global funds like the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, the Green Climate Fund, CEPI, the New Pandemic Fund, and just to make sure as much as possible that the principles that we espouse are integrated. So there's perfect, there's where we are now, and we want to move there step by step.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And I think there was a question to Jenny as well. How is this different? As we talk about shifting power, could it be the same folks, just spewing something new to stay relevant? How do we differentiate what we're trying to do here from what has been same old, and what's the distinction?
Thanks, Wanjiru. I mean, thank you for your question. It's critical. Using language about shifting power is not the same as doing it. And we have to acknowledge that there will be loss. If we are to make a more equitable system, certain parts of the system need to be much smaller than they were. And they have to stop making excuses about lack of capacity in the global south, because what's development aid been doing for decades if there's still no capacity in the global south? So I think there's a danger if you work in an organization and you have a governance structure that asks your organization to succeed organizationally, that does not mean you will succeed systemically. So we are all in danger of being complicit in using language, but not actually doing it. And to me, what has been so liberating about working in the community philanthropy space, even if community philanthropy are not the ideal words and we use them very lightly, it could be solidarity funding or whatever, is this idea of emergence, of Solange's point of like, this stuff has already existed forever. What about we put stuff that we know as humans at the heart of this conversation? But I think along with that, we do need to understand, power cedes nothing without a demand, right? There is loss of power. And that needs to be accompanied too. So that we need to build in both a kind of carrot and a stick, a demand, but also an empathetic understanding that these are people at the heart of this who are defined often by the extent to which they hold a type of power. And I think in all of these conversations, understanding, starting to see this as flow, as harnessing of multiple abundance of resources, rather than I've got it and you want me to give it to you and then I won't have it. And to be honest, I think in our discourse, we are not very well equipped as civil society in terms of the skills we need, the framings we need. We need more articulation, animation, bridge building. We need fewer program officers and MEL officers and whatever. So I do think it challenges us all to think differently. And I'm just putting the link to the Shift the Power manifesto. It really does start with, first, we must start with ourselves and a clarity about how we see our own role as individual in navigating these systems and structures, which were indeed created by people who had a sense of power. So I think, you know, there's the sort of hardware part of this, and then there's the software part of this. And we need to be able to kind of, you know, I think that's where the opportunity to have these conversations in joined up ways allows us to harness both in the different ways that are needed. But it requires new alliances, new configurations, new conversations, and the ability to see across difference. So yeah, but I mean, just to say, saying it is not doing it. And there's a lot of saying it happening at the moment, certainly.
Yeah, certainly, Jenny. And I know there's been a lot of usurping of the shift the power. And there was a question, actually, you know, so bully A is replaced by bully B, you know, in the guise of shifting power. So what can we do to avoid such a scenario? Because we'll find ourselves in the same space, doing the same things, talking about delocalization or localization or decolonization, sorry. So how do we stay vigilant, really, I think is the question, even as we continue to have these conversations?
So I'm not sure if you were directing that to anyone in particular, Wanjiru.
I mean, feel free to answer. Yeah, but go ahead, Solange. Even if it's not related, it's fine.
No. It's to that question, actually, I wanted to react, which I think is a very astute point, right? And we've seen it in many other kind of scenarios, even from race and this sort of discrimination issues. But I think that's just re-emphasizing the importance of transparency and accountability, which citizens and communities really have the responsibility to do. I mean, it might be easy for me to say that, but honestly, I think it's the people, it's the communities that are impacted and affected to hold up that sort of reflective mirror that says, this is not what we put you in power to do. You're not representing our needs and we're going to get rid of you. I think it's about the literacy, the as Jenny was just saying, like making sure that people understand and have less sort of these bureaucratics running projects, but really a groundswell of demand and an understanding about what it is we're actually demanding and having an opportunity to change that. I think this whole concept of GPI being technically sound, but getting the political feasibility part of it really requires sort of the top, but also this community mobilization, which is really built on socializing the concept and really then putting on practical examples about what it is. I think what we keep doing is this rewriting a paper or editing a paper that's sort of poor. And you come in with your red ink and you say, no, change this paragraph, fix this line. But the whole thing is fundamentally wrong. It's the whole concept of how the paper was built is built on something that we want to change, which is why I like that person who said completely dismantle it. I really think at some point you have to just then have a pure example of what GPI looks like in a discrete projects that shows where traditionally poor countries put in money, there's contribution from communities, and you know there you can see the benefits and the decision, the good governance, all of it, and it's showing how it can solve a discrete problem. And I think that's where we need to put our efforts into thinking about what those things can look like while we tweak the other random things around, because we have to live in the world that we have. We can't just burn it all down.
Oh, you muted yourself there at the end, Solange. But yes,
That was
point
it. I dropped the mic. That's what happened. Just kidding.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you. So before I come to you, Anna, I want to give Jacob the mic because he has very interesting questions, comments. I just want to give you just a few seconds to just compress all your thoughts and ask a specific question you have to the panel or give a specific comment, and then we'll go to Anna. I will read out Ganel's question, which is directed to Jonathan. And then we can go to the final round from our panelists, their final interventions. I know time is short, but I'd really like to give an opportunity to folks who have shown an interest in saying something. Jacob, then Anna.
Thank you very much, Wanjiru. And so I think the question, sorry, my voice, the question that, that I keep going back to is, thinking about like how quiet this work needs to be. I know that it's unrealistic to think that work at a global scale and trying to create new systems can be quiet, but the forces that at play are ones that have sort of maintained that power and perpetuate these systems. And so how do we overcome that and do the work without, I don't want to say being loud about it, but sort of to just do the work without really sharing it with I don't know. I'll stop with maybe just being quiet. How do you ensure that the work gets done without it being suppressed?
Oh yeah, right. Okay, so I don't know. I'll open this up perhaps to Jenny or Solange to take this, because again, I don't think you can have a power battle and keep it quiet. We're talking about throwing out and burning the old system. I don't think it shall be silent. They say the revolution shall not be silent. It shall be televised. It shall be on TV. So perhaps Jenny or Jonathan, feel free to just respond to that before we proceed.
That's me nodding to you, Jonathan.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Well, I mean, yeah, it is the sort of existential question, right? I would sort of say, I would turn it into a kind of provocation to ourselves. How can we, at this moment, given that the networks that exist, how can we sort of build solidarity across within the diversity of networks that are there to agree on a minimum but sufficient articulation that the old system is broken and needs to be reformed, transformed, dismantled, or whatever, and that emergent systems are there. We have what we need to build what we need, right? So I think that's and who is bold enough to step forward? That it means we need to understand risk differently, not organizational risk, will we lose, but actually who is prepared to stand alongside whom to actually move into this unknown, because we don't know where we're going. We will build it as we go, but the only way to do it is to iterate, to experiment, to do things in the way that we have never done them before, because the ways we've done them so far clearly don't work. And I think it is also to embrace complexity and navigate it by understanding that it's not just about donors, it's not just about governments, it's about all of those who hold power. If you can build people's ability to hold donors to account, then they sure as hell will hold governments to account, and vice versa. So actually it's a win-win at every level. It's not just about as Solange said, I think writing a paragraph in the system, or renovating your bathroom when your kitchen is flooded, kind of thing. It's really, how do we really challenge ourselves to bring a whole systems approach and carve out the space, the resources to do that collectively? And I think that the resourcing ecosystems to be able to hold this complexity and build the new is sorely missing. We're all trying to do it, on the cheap with the resources that we can scrabble together, and that won't change anything either.
Absolutely, Jenny. I love that response.
Can I just come in before you, Solange, because I actually want to end with a question that you might also be able to answer. It might be quite specific for you. So just on this issue, I really like what's been said at the moment, and there's this balance, isn't there, between we do need tons more international public money. We do. But that's quite hard to get. And B, we also desperately need just to manage the money that we've got or that is available so much better. And that's getting that balance. And one of the favorite titles of any paper I've ever written was one I wrote for the Global Fund for Community Foundations once. It was called From Billions to Millions, because the big thing in international public finance is from billions to trillions. How do we get tons more money? And that is part of that is important. But there's also this focusing on the quality of money, even small amounts. I was in at the Colombian government yesterday, and they were just saying, we don't desperately need more money. We do, but at the same time, we've got some money in education. We've got some money in. We just need to manage it so much better. So there's that balance as well. And then the question that I wanted to ask, I think you might be able to answer, Solange. And going back to the kind of role of communities, is in the building of the Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, and the Global Fund advocacy network that supports that, the role of communities, I think, is maybe, tell me if I'm wrong, one of the best examples of how do you involve communities in the building of global international public finance. But in that case, I think certainly the community that we're talking about is not a geographical community, it's a community of people affected by HIV/AIDS. And I wondered if, A, what I've just said is true because I'm not an expert, but B, what are the lessons from that quite successful involving of communities for us as we want to involve communities in this process?
Yeah, okay, so just going to Jacob's question then to Jonathan, because I wanted to just build off of what Jenny was saying. I just wanted to say specifically that I think we need to be loud and quiet, but I think we start with quiet, which is where I think we need a discrete sort of virgin territory, find a problem and use GPI in a small bite-sized way to show that this thing can work. And then start to use that to say, hey guys, look, proof of concept, it's pure, we did it. Countries that you didn't expect that are traditionally seen as poor contributed, and we've solved X. So I don't know if that's in the climate space. We have some thoughts in the health, the public health space. I don't know, we can think about that and then be able, because I think if we try with World Bank reform, we're going to get stuck. We're just not going to do it. I mean, we have enough advocates there, but I don't think it's going to change literally now. Back to Jonathan's question, yeah, I fully agree with you. I don't think we need more money. I think perhaps that's an argument, that's a debate the academics can have, but it's better use of the money that we currently have. And that has to do with political will. So the technical feasibility of this concept, great, but it's the political will is where we get stuck because we deal with power. And so the idea that we had like 60 trillions in economic damage due to COVID, and then we said, okay, let's have a collective response. This shouldn't happen again. And we said we need 10 billion per year, and we've raised what, 1.8 billion and been able to give out some grants. I think that's what the numbers are. So it's clearly an issue with will, and it's not an issue of having the actual funds to figure it out. I think Global Fund, and then maybe I pass to Anna Wanjiru. I think the question around Global Fund is an interesting one. On one hand, I love the Global Fund. I think they do fantastic work. The country coordinating mechanism is the process by which countries are funded, because they don't fund governments, they fund countries, and they make that distinction very clear, and it's what the country wants. But then it relies on a CCM, or country coordinating mechanism, that works, which gets you into my original point about national dynamics, where you want to see where the stuff hits the fan. Well, it's there. Why are you in the room? The minister is here. And so it's the power dynamics in the room, and getting communities to literally be able to say, well, no, we actually think the funds should come to this. This is what our lived reality is. And they say, no, we need to do something else. And so that kind of interplay is exactly the sticky part and the messy part of this. And yeah, it can be around people living with HIV, which is a much more organized community, but it's also malaria, it's also TB. And I think the Global Fund tries to put forward that thing, that the process or the philosophy that communities need to input. But again, it's sort of traditional because there's replenishment, and it's sort of this mix with the community and country coordinating mechanisms. I think we need a clear space that shows a GPI from the outset to solve a discrete problem. Let's find something and prove that this thing can work. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Solange. And let me just apologize for taking maybe another 10 or 15 minutes of your time. This seems to be a very interesting conversation. I want to go to Anna, then come back to Jonathan with some specific questions, and then we can see how to wrap up this conversation we probably won't have another round of questions, but just a parting shot from our panelists. Anna, go ahead.
Yes, listening to everyone's input regarding this issue, all I was thinking is that this is 100% an ecosystem problem, and there everyone plays a role. So it's not only top-down solutions, but also bottom-up solutions need to be included in those dynamics. And when talking about shifting power, there's another element of shifting narratives. There are some concepts of public funding that have been utilized for so many years in ways that civil society does not feel the empowerment to use it as their own terms. And one of those words is power. Like power, it's a really contrasting word when you're thinking about you being civil society, you being an organizer, you being a problem solver. So you think of yourself as someone that is fighting power instead of someone that could hold it. In that sense, that change of ecosystem, it's also making civil society understand the power that they have in this conversation, and that actually the shift of the ecosystem, for it to be different, for it to be innovative, for it to be different from anything else that it's going on, it is important, as Solange was saying, that it's not only on one direction, it's something as a network that works from different directions, that it's not something static. It's not just a panel of experts. It's something that involves a lot of conversations. It's something that, as Jasmine mentioned something in the comments regarding the nature on how funds are being allocated and the preference for flexibility, like that sometimes is restrained by laws itself. Some countries that have a restricted civic space, we activists, we work through the embassies of other countries. So how can we actually globally cross-collaborate in these movements, actually having the power, the structure, the place in the conversation to frame that relationship? And in that sense, it's if we identify the elements that could put civil society more in power in this conversation, then the role of the network is to put that ecosystem into motion. And that is exactly the potential that I see in this, that I feel that it's the same that my organization sees in this, that it's a really great point of connection between the higher level conversation and the grassroots level challenges that this is facing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I can see some of that has fed into the question asked by Ganel in terms of a practical way of channeling GPI money from international to local in countries with democratic national governments and in authoritarian countries. And Solange has given a very good example of the global fund money and how that is channeled. Anna has spoken into, if it's a more difficult context in terms of what kind of national government is in power, for instance, then there can be innovative ways of implementing GPI principles through other partners and other institutions that would help, help these principles take hold, especially at community level. I want to go back to Jonathan and perhaps in closing, right? And I know this conversation could go on and on. It's a difficult one to cut, but in closing, probably speak into how GPI would, solve, and this partly goes into Martin's question, how GPI should work in terms of equitably including those currently denied power. Part of that has been answered, and how really, it could work practically at a community level. And we see then what the takeaway is really. What do we walk away with from this conversation around GPI? Is it follow-ups? Is it community engagement? What does that look like? And then we can hear from the other panelists. Jonathan.
So I'm not the guy that knows about community engagement. There are real experts on this call. that can kind of translate these principles and this approach to an effective way of engaging communities. I like what Martin is implying here. And I think that, and it kind of, Jenny mentioned this kind of, she said circular logic earlier, and this kind of applying mutuality and circularity, dignity and respect, listening and voice, participation, ownership, not just in the kind of top-down international public aid sphere, but in the various places where we work. And then Martin's saying, you know, there's a way to assess this, you know, and, you know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, is kind of, I think, where a bit of what Martin's coming from. You know, how do you actually concretize this? Then I think that makes sense as well, you know, and it also kind of answers the question, well, we never get to GPI. I mean, you never get to where we want to get to, but we can move along. It's always a spectrum. It's always, how well are we doing on ownership? How well are we doing on listening? How well are we doing on power? And I like it. All I'll say is I like this idea. It's sown a seed in me. How can we put these principles into something that approaches a measurement and assessment? But like I say, when it comes to actually achieving that at a community level, I'm massively keen and massively involved, but I'm not the person that's going to be able to answer that question because it hasn't been my work, at least for quite a long time.
And fair enough. So fair enough, Jonathan. That's absolutely acceptable. Also, because we are still building, we don't have all the answers, but we are in. It's actually an invitation to those on this call, you know, in other spaces, to come and join us as we rethink this concept and figure out how do we bring equity to this model and, you know, to these frameworks that we've been working with. I want to move on to Solange. And Solange, I know a lot has been said about how communities engage, but I want you to just give us a parting shot in terms of what can we do at community level, what practical steps can we take, and how can we engage specifically with GPI or like-minded organizations, because collaboration is what is needed at this point, you know, and how do we move on from here?
Yeah, look, I don't think that's an easy question, but I do think that if we keep doing what we're doing now, we're not going to change anything. So we have to get out of our same old, like, you know, you talk to people in HIV, no, you talk to people in health. Now you have to realize you talk to people in health, but the greatest, you know, threat to health is climate. So you better be talking to people in climate. People in climate will talk to you about vulnerability and women, and you get into tax justice and social protection and girls empowerment, etc. So we have to make alliances in other social justice movements and get out of our own way sometimes. And I think I think I really liked what's Anna's point. Is it Anna? God, I'm now losing my.
Yes, it's Anna.
Anna's point. No, I'm just trying to remember who made the point. I think it was Anna's point because I wrote it down about changing the narrative and this idea that communities feel like they don't have power, or power is a bad thing to have, or whatever strange baggage we come with from childhood or working in the NGO space with power, and realizing just as Ruto, you know, President Ruto, President Ramaphosa at the Macron summit, and you'll hear them all having the same sort of commentary that we are not beggars anymore. We are coming to the table with equity. We want to contribute. We are not a drag on the system. You need to engage with us differently. Communities are saying the same thing for decades, either to the national governments, if they would ever listen, but also to the wider global space, that we come with solutions, and the engagement with power has to be sort of massaged and understood at the grassroots level. And I think there's just a lot of work ahead of us. But conversations like this, where we are honest, I think is the stepping stones to where we want to get to. Thanks.
Brilliant, Solange. I really like that. I mean, the idea is not new if you think about it, and people have been agitating and advocating for, you know, for community voice for decades, you know. So yeah, it's about, you know, that solidarity and seeing how we can collaborate more strongly across the spaces we work. Thank you so much for that perspective. I want to close with Jenny. I know we are a bit over time, but I want to pass the mic to Jenny to just give us a taste of what we should expect in Bogota in December, and any other conversations that shall be coming up in the next few weeks, and anything else from the Global Fund that we should be aware of. Thank you, Jenny. Over to you.
Thank you, Wanjiru. I will be brief. So the summit is happening 5th to 7th of December in Bogota. I've just put the website in the chat. But I think the point is, so far we have 481 people from 70 countries coming, large representation from the Global South. I think a key purpose of the summit is to find the space for frontline activists, civil society activists who don't have much time to reflect on systems change and sort of challenging themselves. They're so busy to think about how you reform or transform the system. People are so busy doing their work, often in ways that are simply under-resourced and are not sustainable. So a key dimension of the summit is to kind of validate, re-energize, harness the energies of what's already out there, to join those dots, but also where people are coming from, international NGOs or the funding system, is to invite them into that sense of seeing what the possible future looks like. Let's move away from the ways we've been understanding around how social change is achieved, the metric of money, large grants going to single organizations to deal with complex problems. What comes out of this call very much is it's complex. We need new ways of doing this kind of work. So the summit is an opportunity for people to come together in person and to kind of experiment with that, what happens when people from different parts of the system collide and agree to do business together. But in the lead up to the summit, this is one of the number of weaving conversations that members of our networks and GPI and Global Nation have co-hosted this one with us, but others are organizing around a range of issues around dignity, around decolonizing aid. There's one coming up soon for Francophone Africa, what does shift the power mean there? Another one coming from a group of African colleagues around who owns civil society. And I think, again, we're trying to model the idea that actually, if we start showing all these questions and conversations alongside each other, we start to have something along the lines of a critical mass. Actually, this is what the constant shaking of all of these ideas may help move us forward. So I would extend an invitation to all of you on this call, whether you're in Bogota or not, to be part of this conversation. Actually, let's do this thing. Let's test it. Let's see how far we get, because it's complicated, and the summit is just one moment. But the idea is that we continue to work across this complexity in multiple different ways afterwards. So today is really a taster of how do we do this? How do we get better at doing this? I'll stop there, Wanjiru. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. And I can only pray and hope that we have given, this 1.5 hours thereabout justice to this session, where we've tried to delve into somewhat complex ideas, new ideas of doing things, new ways of doing things. And we know change is never easy. There's always resistance. Power is never given up freely. So I know this is a journey that's going to be, tough, but, if we're many, the rallying call is out there for us to get engaged, reach out to us, reach out to any of the colleagues on this call. I know the Shift the Power movement is growing in number and in strength. The GPI network movement is also growing. Feel free to reach out to us. We can share resources. I can see Wendy has shared the Shift the Power website link and the conversations that are ongoing. We can share with you our just released report on GPI, just to give you, more details, more information of how it works, even at community level, how funding can practically flow to communities, to countries at national and regional level. And apologies if we're not able to take your questions, but we will be happy to continue conversations offline in Bogota and whichever other spaces that are made available to us. So allow me to bring this conversation to a close. Feel free to reach out to us, as I've mentioned, and we look forward to seeing you at the next conversation, which I think is in 1 week, if I'm not wrong. You can, just check on the Shift the Power website or on their social media platforms. There's, interesting conversations going on, and we look forward to seeing you in Bogota. Thank you so much for making time, and thank you to our partners for making this possible. Thank you, and have a lovely evening, day, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.